The wind moved slowly across the plains that morning, brushing the tall grass into long, quiet waves under a pale sky. Early autumn had begun to settle over the valley, bringing cooler air and the smell of dry earth. A small ranch sat alone near a bend in the creek, its wooden fences stretching out across acres of grazing land where cattle moved lazily under the rising sun. Jacob Turner leaned against the fence outside the barn, watching the herd in silence. His hat shaded his face, but the lines of exhaustion around his eyes could not be hidden. The past week had been the hardest of his life. His older brother, Thomas Turner, was gone. A sudden fever had taken him only 6 days earlier, leaving the ranch quiet in a way Jacob had never known before. For most of his life, the two brothers had worked side by side on this land. Thomas had been the one with the plans, the dreams, the steady voice that made hard days easier. Now the ranch felt larger and emptier than ever. Jacob shifted his weight and looked toward the house. The small wooden cabin stood near a grove of cottonwood trees, its porch still, its windows reflecting the morning light. Inside were Thomas's belongings, his books, his boots by the door, and the letter that had arrived 3 days too late. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck and let out a slow breath. He had read that letter more times than he cared to admit. It had arrived in a neat envelope with careful handwriting on the front. At first he thought it was another business note or a supply request. But when he opened it, he found something else entirely. The letter had been written by a woman named Clara Whitmore. She explained that she had answered a mail-order advertisement placed by Thomas months earlier. They had exchanged several letters and agreed that she would travel west to become his wife. Her train was scheduled to arrive in the nearby town of Silver Creek at the end of the week. Jacob remembered sitting at the table, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Thomas had never told him. Not once had he mentioned writing to a woman back east, and now Thomas was gone. Jacob stared out at the cattle again, the wind tugging lightly at the brim of his hat. The woman would arrive tomorrow. He still wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. The sun had climbed higher when Jacob finally returned to the house. He stepped inside and poured himself a cup of coffee from the kettle that had been sitting on the stove since dawn. The silence inside the cabin felt heavy. Thomas had always filled a room with his voice. Even when they worked quietly, Jacob could feel his brother's presence nearby. Now every creak of the floorboards sounded louder. Jacob sat at the table and unfolded Clara's letter again. Her handwriting was graceful, steady, the kind of writing that suggested patience and care. She had written about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about her love of reading and her wish to build a new life somewhere far from the crowded streets of the East. In her last paragraph, she had written something simple that lingered in Jacob's mind. "I hope that when I arrive, we may find kindness in one another and build a life worth sharing." Jacob folded the letter slowly. He wondered what she would think when she learned the truth. The following afternoon he saddled his horse and rode toward Silver Creek. The town sat nearly 15 miles away, a small collection of buildings clustered around a dusty main street. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and the train station that connected this quiet valley to the rest of the country. The train was due to arrive just before sunset. Jacob tied his horse near the station and stood beside the wooden platform, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. A few townspeople waited nearby, chatting quietly as the evening light turned golden. In the distance, the faint whistle of the approaching train echoed through the valley. Jacob felt a tightening in his chest. The train rolled into the station with a long hiss of steam and clatter of metal wheels. Passengers began stepping down one by one, carrying bags and looking around with curious eyes. Then Jacob saw her. She stepped down carefully from the train, holding a small suitcase with both hands. She wore a simple blue dress and a light brown coat. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. For a moment she looked around the platform, searching. Her eyes finally settled on Jacob. She hesitated before walking toward him. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Are you Mr. Thomas Turner?" The words struck Jacob harder than he expected. He removed his hat slowly. "No, ma'am," he replied. Her expression shifted with confusion. "My name is Jacob Turner," he said quietly. Her eyes widened slightly. "Jacob," she repeated. "Thomas's brother." He nodded. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "Is Thomas here?" she asked. Jacob swallowed. "No," he said softly, "he isn't." The silence between them stretched for several long seconds. Clara looked down at her suitcase, then back at Jacob. "What do you mean?" she asked. Jacob took a slow breath. "My brother passed away last week," he said. The words hung heavily in the warm evening air. Clara's face went pale. She stood very still, as if the world around her had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. I didn't know," she whispered. "I figured you didn't," Jacob said gently. For a moment she simply stared at the ground, her hands tightening around the handle of her suitcase. "I traveled nearly 1,000 miles," she said quietly. "I know." Another silence settled between them. Jacob shifted awkwardly. "I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing," he said. Clara shook her head slowly. "It wasn't for nothing," she said. He looked at her, surprised. She lifted her gaze toward him, and though sadness lingered in her eyes, there was also a quiet strength there. "Your brother and I wrote to each other for months," she said. "Even if we never met, those letters meant something." Jacob nodded. "I believe that." The sun dipped lower behind the hills. Clara glanced toward the road beyond the station. "I suppose I should find a place to stay tonight," she said. Jacob hesitated. The sensible thing would be to help her find a room at the small boarding house in town. By morning she could arrange another train ticket and return east. But something about the way she stood there, alone in a strange place after traveling so far, made him pause. "You're welcome to stay at the ranch," he said suddenly. Clara looked up. "Just until you figure out what you want to do next." He added quickly, "There's plenty of room." She studied him carefully, weighing his offer. "You'd be willing to do that?" she asked. "It's the least I can do," Jacob said. After a moment she nodded. "Thank you." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The sky darkened into deep shades of purple and blue as the first stars appeared above the plains. Clara rode behind Jacob on the wagon seat, her suitcase resting at her feet. When they reached the ranch house, the porch lantern cast a warm glow across the yard. Clara stepped down and looked around. The ranch was larger than she expected. The barn stood tall against the night sky, and the cattle could be heard moving softly in the nearby pasture. "It's beautiful," she said. Jacob shrugged slightly. "It's home." Inside the house, Clara removed her coat and glanced around the room. Jacob noticed her eyes pause on a framed photograph sitting on the shelf. It showed two men standing beside a herd of cattle. "That's Thomas," Jacob said quietly. She stepped closer. He pointed to the man on the right. Clara studied the photograph for a long moment. "He looks exactly how I imagined," she said softly. Jacob felt a strange warmth in his chest. Over the next few days, Clara remained at the ranch while she considered her options. She helped with small tasks around the house and spent time reading on the porch in the afternoons. Jacob showed her the land and explained how the ranch operated. Slowly, the awkwardness between them began to fade. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. "I've been thinking," Clara said. Jacob glanced at her. I could return east. She continued, but there's nothing waiting for me there. He listened quietly. I came here hoping to build a new life, she said, even if it didn't happen the way I expected. The breeze moved gently through the cottonwood trees. I've grown fond of this place, she said. Jacob felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. And of the people here, she added. He looked at her then. Are you saying you want to stay? He asked. She nodded slowly. If you'd allow it. Jacob leaned back in his chair. You don't owe me anything, he said. I know, she replied. She met his eyes. I want to stay because it feels right. Months passed. Winter came and went, followed by the bright green days of spring. Clara became a familiar presence around the ranch. She planted a small garden near the house and filled the rooms with laughter and music. Jacob found himself looking forward to every conversation they shared. One warm evening, nearly a year after her arrival, they walked together along the fence line as the sun sank behind the hills. Clara paused and looked out across the land. You know, she said softly, sometimes life takes us somewhere we never planned to go. Jacob nodded. But sometimes, she continued, that road leads exactly where we were meant to be. He looked at her, realizing in that moment how deeply his life had changed since the day she stepped off that train. Clara, he said. She turned toward him. I think my brother would have been glad you came here, he said. Her eyes softened. And I'm grateful you stayed. A gentle smile touched her lips. I'm glad I did too. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. And as they stood there together on the quiet prairie, both of them understood something simple and profound. Love had not arrived the way either of them expected, but sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the truest kind of home.